Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to e-scooters and micromobility accidents. I'm Emily Formby, and with Dan Laking, we are going to talk to you this lunchtime. Our strapline promised that we would tell you all about coming litigation and how to cope with it. Perhaps a vaunting claim, but the latest industry figures seem to show that injury claims are plummeting. Not really sure why, but perhaps this is a new area that's going to step into whatever void there might be. Anyway, if nothing else, we hope to provide you with a little diversion and entertainment as you eat your sandwiches this fine day. As we go through, if you do have any questions, please do put them into questions and answer box if you wish to. We're recording this session, and we hope to try and answer the question and answers as we go along. But if we're not able to, we will happily come back to you and answer them later. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, pop a question into that question and answer box, and our behind the scenes brilliant team will help you. So without further ado, I'm Emily Formby, and at 39, I practice in injury work, claimant and defendant, lots of road traffic accidents, and have talked quite a lot about e-scooters. Well, not an awful lot has yet happened, but that may yet change. And I'm delighted to say that I'm talking today with Dan.
Hi, thank you very much for joining us, all of you. My name is Daniel Laking, and I also specialise in injury work with a mixed practice claimant and defendant. Emily and I have been doing this webinar, or a version of it now, for over 2 years, and it's been really fascinating to see how the landscape has changed within that time, and how the landscape continues to change. So we hope, even if you've seen at least some of the content before, that there are some new tidbits to keep you up to date with what's happening in this interesting field.
So let's see what they are. I am in charge of the tech, so that is borderline catastrophic, but I'll do my best. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of pros and cons of micromobility. I mean, when we first started to give this talk, as Dan said, that was one of the kind of main things we talked about, is what is micromobility, where is it going, what are the pros and cons about it. I'm not even sure that's a consideration now, because without doubt, we're in it to win it. Micromobility and e-scooters are here to stay, even if we don't quite know what they look like. One of the big drivers, obviously, is this whole concept of last mile transport and the environmental factors, and at one point positive cost savings. Not so sure if they're going to be as positive now with all the increased price of electricity. But don't forget that one of the things that we really learned from the pandemic was also the significant improvement in air quality that occurred when people stopped driving cars. And you might remember some of those photographs showing places like Delhi and New Mexico without fog for the first time in years. And, you know, moving towards a world like that has always been, to my mind, one of the great drivers behind this form of transport, or forms of more sustainable transport, but not necessarily the only concern. Government go on a lot about a new £1 billion industry that they're hoping to build and develop, which will feed into the growth strategy, no doubt. There are also obviously significant negatives, and we've put a few of them down. Fire being a considerable negative, and you may well know that e-scooters are banned from all transport for London and the Underground, and indeed that's an area that has received a bit of headline news today, as we know that there's been a huge increase in fires and fire warnings. Something like Zurich, the insurers obtained a freedom of information data that the firefighters in London have attended something like 88 fires caused by e-bikes in the last year, increase of 80% or so, and a problem about lithium batteries, people using either poor lithium batteries or charging them incorrectly. But this alarming spate of fires is something that is clearly a downside of this micromobility world. Anyway, yeah.
Yes, I was just thinking, you know, well, I think one of the key drivers is going to be the clean air that comes, particularly in cities, with e-scooters and micromobility. But perhaps if they're if they're setting on fire all the time. And the clean air caused by micromobility might in fact be undermined somewhat.
Yeah, you ban your open fire in your fire pit. You allow your on fire e-scooter. No, anyway, not too flippant too soon. Over to Dan to talk a little bit about the e-scooters themselves.
Yeah, so this is about where are we now? Well, contrary to the numbers that you see on the roads, e-scooters, privately owned e-scooters, are still illegal. They are classed or meet the definition of motorcycles for the purposes of the Road Traffic Act. And what that means is that they need to comply with the regulations placed upon motorcycles. So they need to have insurance and MOT, but of course you can't get insurance and they don't have an MOT at the moment, which means they are illegal. And similarly, people say, well, why can't you ride them on the pavement? And you can't ride them on the pavement because, contrary to the Highways Act, mechanically propelled vehicles are not allowed on pavement. So they are not legal on roads, nor are they legal on pavements, but they are legal to be sold. So despite that, we are seeing a huge increase in the number of private e-scooters that are being sold, some with warnings as to where and where they can't be ridden, some without. And it's also easy to purchase them online where standards and product liability are perhaps less rigorously enforced compared with those which are imported by large organizations in the UK. But separate to the private e-scooters, there's also trial e-scooters, and they are perfectly legal on the roads. There's a carve out in the legislation for them. The trials were first launched in July 2020. They've been extended twice since then. So they were first extended up until November 2022, and they've now been extended until mid-2024. Most or many cities now across the UK are employing some form of trial e-scooters. And so what that means is that there is perhaps confusion within by the general public because they see e-scooters on the roads. They think therefore all e-scooters are legal, but of course that's not the case. So then moving on to the trials, the striking feature of the trials generally is that they allow for an enormous degree of control over the e-scooters themselves, both in terms of the product, but also in terms of the way in which they can be used. So as it says on the slide, they are subject to minimum technical requirements. They have maximum speed of 15.5 miles per hour. And of course, within the trial, there is compulsory insurance, which is provided by the trial provider. So be that Bolt, Lime, Voy. But of course, also they are flexible. So the trials allow for a degree of flexibility depending on where they are. So despite the top speeds being 15.5 miles per hour in London, for example, the top speeds are limited to 12. Similarly, in Chelmsford, you need to do a training course in order to be entitled to ride one for the first time. And you have to answer a safety quiz if you take one out in London. So the trials allow for control, both in terms of the products themselves, but also in terms of the way in which they're used. And we see that, for example, with geocaching. They are tracked with their location at all times. So they can be slowed right down to 6 miles per hour if riding through a pedestrianized area or a park, for example. Similarly, they can only be parked in areas which are on the right side of the line in terms of where you are on the app. And if you've ever tried to park one that's very near the border, it is so irritating having to wheel it around, 2 railings further down in order to be on the right side of Hyde Park rather than the wrong side.
Yeah. They can be really annoying. There was they had a thing with they wouldn't let, there's a parking bay just outside Chambers, and they kept refusing to let me stop there, and it won't turn off. And of course the simple thing is they just keep charging you, so of course you keep moving. And then saying they're fining me for parking illegally, and they accept, our geocaching isn't entirely fail safe. So you get control, but you also get this sort of big brother watching you and preventing you taking sensible decisions. You sort of lose that agency, really, don't you? Anyway, sorry, I interrupted, but it was very annoying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think basically the headline here is, in striking comparison with the situation in respect of privately controlled e-scooters, the trial e-scooters are very highly controlled. no drink scooting, one person at a time, no phones or bags, helmets, not PPE, not mandatory, but advisory. And of course, you need to have a provisional driving license, which means you need to be under 16. All of that completely out of the window when it comes to private ones, which are entirely unregulated due to their entirely illegal status.
Yeah, that's very true. So having a little look at the regulations, so to speak, in action, about the only regulation that we have got that's in general is the new highway code, which came into force a year ago in January last year. You might have missed it. It was exceptionally quiet. There was a bit of a flurry of advertising in the spring, and in the summer there was actually rather sweet, I thought, public awareness campaign of posters and little videos basically saying, you know, if you run someone over, you might think they're an annoying person on a bike, or they're an annoying person stepping out in front of you on the road, but actually, you know, this is Bob who likes to mend bikes, or this is Mary who can't cook, or whatever. And they had these little vignettes about, you know, we're all nice people, or everyone is a person to someone else, so don't run them over, was the sort of strapline, although they did it a bit more elegantly. Anyway, that was the sort of main code of the highway code. And in fact, the new highway code and the changes were predominantly about vulnerable road users, actually, in the wider sense. A lot of them were about cycling, horses, space, and sort of looking after those that are not in cars. But it was completely silent on micromobility and e-scooters. One of the key changes, which everyone will know about, is the hierarchy of road users, and ranking people from the smallest and squashiest and most vulnerable if they're hit being pedestrians, up to the kind of least vulnerable being very large, you know, well, I guess a tank, but on the road on the road with legitimacy, HGVs and coaches. But there's nothing about micromobility and nothing about e-scooters in that hierarchy of road users. We've probably all played that game of where would you put them on the pyramid, but they are absent. In some ways, the hierarchy of road users is no more than a codification of the concept of causative potency that we're all well used to in the field of contributory negligence, and essentially saying that, you know, if you run someone over as a lorry driver, you're going to need really, really good evidence about what you were doing and why you were doing it and what choices you made. Whereas if you're a small child and you run into the middle of the road and you don't look very well, then obviously the standard of evidence and causative potency is much lower. And those are things we all know from case law, and we all know from the road traffic litigation arena, but now essentially it's codified in the hierarchy of road users. There was a massive campaign, and it's important to remember there was a significant campaign prior to the highway code coming into force for the hierarchy to be one of presumed liability. And indeed, in most European countries, that is the case. And it's one of the things we have to watch when we're dealing with European litigation. But in fact, the UK remains one of only about 5 European countries where the hierarchy is not presumed liability. When there is presumed liability, there's a rebuttable presumption that the liability attaches to the most powerful road user. So effectively a rebuttable presumption that the HGV is at fault, and a natural switch to the burden of proof. And we don't have that. And I think in some ways it is because our common law system, you know, as you know, every single case talks about the judicial importance of assessment of contributory negligence, and even on appeal, the court of, you know, the higher courts are exceptionally reluctant to challenge any finding that a judge has made about contributory negligence, having heard the live evidence and having heard the witness evidence, because our system is one that does allow for that finessing of evaluating who did what in the agony of the moment and what they saw and what responsibility they had. And that sort of causative potency concept remains good. So in some ways, the just and equitable outcome looking at causative potency within that contributory negligence arena remains, I would say, that sort of the watchword of the hierarchy of road users. So if we look at the sort of liability considerations in the broader sense, and then we'll kind of dig a bit deeper into the e-scooter sense, really, I would say that you remain with those main liability considerations of the standard Road Traffic Act questions. Where does fault lie? You know, who's to blame? What were they doing? Why were they doing it? And I think that remains the case in multi-party accidents. And that consideration of the rules of the road in the highway code has now imported a sense of where was the bike, what was the bike doing, where was the horse, had you left them enough room, with a concept of what that might look like. So it gives a better codification rather than necessarily changing the balance or the ambit of what is what. And I think that, sorry, yeah.
Interesting. No, I was just going to say, you can think of some interesting fact patterns where that kind of a question is going to be tested in a way that it hasn't yet in respect of e-scooters. So, somebody driving an e-scooter hits a pothole and falls off and is then run over by someone. You'd have a lot of questions over, did you leave them enough room? Were you cognizant of the fact that there was a risk that they might come off it, et cetera, and should any liability attach to a vehicle driver in a circumstance like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And we know from, a standard case, the fact that one person is doing something wrong doesn't obviate you of responsibility for your own actions. Exactly. Just because somebody's speeding doesn't mean you can do what you like, or just because you've got the right of way doesn't mean you can pull out willy-nilly without looking. I mean, you're absolutely right. Those are all questions we have. But I think, one of the interesting things will be, what is the standard of duty? I mean, what standard of duty do we expect of an e-scooter rider? We know, a reasonably competent driver, well, we kind of have an idea of what that looks like, a reasonably competent pedestrian, taking into account that children might be less competent than others. But what is a reasonably competent e-scooter driver? And frankly, if your kind of standard is set by what the majority do, I don't think it's going to be the case that your reasonably competent e-scooter driver wears black, bounces on and off the pavement, modifies their machine to go like the clappers and weaves in and out of pedestrians. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I'm not sure that's going to be the standard. So what does a reasonably competent e-scooter rider look like with novel technology? And we might have a little answer for you going on when we get to TfL a bit later on. But other things about, what about if not wearing PPE? I mean, as Dan said a minute ago, a lot of the e-scooter trials, that the legitimate trials, they'll be saying, well, you should be wearing a helmet, but it's not mandatory. Is that something that's going to become a mandatory regulation moving forward, even though it never has in the UK with bikes? But are we going to get a Finch and Smith type of situation of saying, well, you ought to, even if you don't, or even go as far as a sort of Froome and Butcher, when you've got the law ahead of seatbelt regulations, saying you should, we're going to take it into account. Who knows? But I do see a rich future of further webinars as we tackle these questions. Anyway, Dan's going to talk about what legislation there is or not.
Yeah, so this is where we're moving on now in terms of the legalization landscape and the legislative landscape. And as we put on the slide there, the Queen's speech in 2022 announced that there was a broad ambition to improve transport, deliver safer, cleaner services. Now, no express reference to e-scooters in there, but one of the key drivers, as set out by Baroness Veer, was in respect of e-scooters, and the aim to create a regulatory framework for e-scooters. So I think this is interesting because there's been a shift in governmental statements on this point. When we last did this webinar, in terms of the question about what were the legislative proposals, it was very much a watch this space. Government is saying, well, we're not sure yet. We don't know whether this is something we will legalise. Now, it seems to be that there has been a real shift in the narrative so that the travel is towards legalisation of e-scooters. And the question has become, okay, how and what regulations, rather than should we or shouldn't we? And so in terms of the striking difference, that is my takeaway. It's interesting that Baroness Veer said that their popularity is clear. New rules are needed to improve safety and crack down on illegal use. Because of course it's the government's, at the moment they're all illegal, so there is no cracking down on illegal use. Let's get them all off the roads. But
absolutely. I mean, and she's also quite keen on the multi-billion-pound industry side of it.
Yeah,
and actually, when she says their popularity is clear, yeah, well, so is their unpopularity.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fair. Anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, I think it's absolutely right to say that what's happened here is that we've seen a shift towards they are popular, we need to regulate, from lots of people hate them, should they be on the roads at all, which is a striking change in the kind of policy landscape. So then moving on, the House of Commons Transport Committee, so some of the more concrete statements. April 2022, there was an intention announced by the Transport Secretary to introduce legislation to deal with some of these points, so to regulate private e-scooters, and announce things like a technical framework and technical standards for them. And the way that that was proposed was to essentially create a carve out, much as we've got now for trial e-scooters, for privately owned e-scooters as well. It was said that the government wanted to crack down on the private market and make it illegal to sell e-scooters which don't meet the regulatory standards. Query what those regulatory standards are or will be. That was strikingly absent from the comments. Jesse Norman then in November 2022, again confirming the intention of the government to create low-speed zero-emission vehicles, or LZEVs, which would be this carve-out in the regulations, which would essentially impose some but not the entirety of the barrage of motor vehicle requirements on e-scooters.
I mean, it might be a teeny bit of a relief if they're going to create this new category of vehicles, given that it's taken it's now getting on for 3 or 4 years and they've not managed to do anything specifically for e-scooters. If we had to go one by one with each new bit of tech, we might never get there. So hopefully at least the LZEV will enable a framework upon which other developments can hang. You know, if we ever get the kind of Back to the Future hoverboard, it can sort of slot into the LZEV as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what that means is also there will be flexibility in terms of, instead of saying something like, right, well, all we're going to do is amend the requirements for motorcycles so that they include so that the e-scooters can comply with them. No, we're saying, okay, there's going to be a new specific kind of category of vehicle, which will have some but not all of the requirements, or will have different requirements. So I think that's also important to watch this space in terms of where we come out with. The government said that they will consult publicly about those regulations before any are made. Query what further consultation is required at this stage. We've been in trials for 2+ years now. There's been lots of research done. The government is saying, no, further consultation is required. I suspect you could have a decent stab at what those regulations might look like without any further consultation, but based on the progress that has been made so far, unlikely to see anything quickly, I suspect.
I think that's true. And of course, what we do know is quite a lot of countries have done it the other way around. I mean, so Ireland came up with their regulations and legislation before they let anything out at all. Or Paris, which have had their e-scooters for about 4 years, they then changed their regulations after a little while, but they had regulations, popped them in, and then saw what was happening. Anyway, but what are we going to do here? So the government plans, that was all going well. And Grant Shapps, now he was Minister for Transport, and I just had in my head a sudden that everyone swung around and changed around so incredibly quickly. If I've got that wrong, I do forgive me. And I think that's what he was at the time. Anyway, in April 2022, he said that once the standards for privately owned e-scooters had been set, then the government could decide how they would be used. So again, that's not in a sort of ringing endorsement of sort of speed and action.
It also slightly strikes me as cart before the horse there, because surely you don't know how to regulate them if you haven't decided where they're going to be used or how they're going to be used.
And also, what about all the ones that exist? I mean, you know, are you going to have a moratorium and say, bring in your e-scooter that has now teeny tiny wheels that aren't big enough to be legitimate, or that goes too fast, and we will modify it or give you another one, or, you know, as you say, and if you've got your standards, then you can decide, you know, well, anyway, there we are. But that's what they said then. Unfortunately, it's all got a bit quieter ever since, because in January, that should be a little bit earlier, but just before that, Lord Rosser in the House of Lords debate said e-scooters have got much to offer, but you need to have relevant and appropriate guidelines to address the safety concerns. And he was acknowledging, I mean, a few months before Baroness Veer, but he was acknowledging that there were concerns, that it's not all a sort of one-way street of joy and delectation of micromobility. Anyway, at least there was sort of movement. And then really just before Christmas, a little bit depressingly, Mark Harper, the Secretary of State for Transport, used his maiden appearance in front of the Transport Select Committee to say, sorry about that, their transport bill that came out in the Queen's speech in May and that Baroness Veer talked about, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be put before Parliament in this current session. And of course, we can all, accept and understand that there have been many things that have occurred that were not anticipated in this last government, in this last parliamentary session, that have meant things have not gone smoothly on the legislation front, and they've run out of time. But it is obviously a bitter disappointment. The transport bill, this much vaunted change, has basically been sort of mothballed or kicked down the road, or some other analogy that I can't think of at the moment. So it doesn't look now as if an awful lot more is going to happen. And this sort of lack of plans really feeds through into a sort of feeling of overall sort of disquiet about the whole process. Labour MP in Newport, Jessica Morden, she's quite a sort of vocal e-scooter, not opponent, but concerned citizen. I mean, she speaks up a lot for those that are troubled by e-scooters and those that sort of whiz past them on the pavement. And in the first House of Commons debate at the end of day adjournment on the 8th of December, so the next day, she said, that there's concern about lack of regulation. There's concern about lack of control over the sale of untested and potentially unsafe privately owned e-scooters, and that it is a real problem. And so the more that this transport bill is delayed and the more that the regulation doesn't occur, you simply get more and more of these e-scooters arriving.
Yeah, and this is the thing that we're seeing,
yeah.
isn't it? I think,
Yeah.
that the longer it's delayed, the more out of step the legislative landscape is with the realities on the ground, which is that actually sales of these things are increasing year on year, and there are more and more of them on the roads.
Absolutely. And she was saying at Newport, her constituency, they don't have a trial. So there's no safe rental at all. I mean, no legal rental at all. Every single e-scooter in her patch are illegally on the road. And that it's causing real problems for her constituents. So Jessie Norman said, we recognise the current lack of regulation is at odds, but it's not much is happening. So we're promised the right regulation designed to create proper accountability and responsibility, but we don't know when. And again, this suggestion that gathering data will happen soon and more information, will be gathered, despite in September people asking for support. So Jessica Morden again raised a question with the Home Secretary about support for the police and at least policing. Every single e-scooter that's in Newport should be stopped and off the road because there's no legal use of them. So it, as you say, there's this sort of mismatch of billion-pound industry that we'd really like to crack on and regulate versus the kind of wild west of whatever else is happening. Anyway, so the Transport Committee produced a report on e-scooters back in October 2020 when they were pretty much in favour. I mean, so this was obviously when Middlesbrough just started right at the beginning of the trial scheme. They said that that the title was e-scooters, pavement nuisance or transport innovation. So as you say, a couple of years ago, there was much more of a caveated approach to the e-scooter, which, Dan, as you say, is rather changed with the kind of, here we go, let's unlock this business opportunity. And they ended up broadly in favour of e-scooters, and did actually highlight the fact that we're the last major EU economy where e-scooters are banned, but the use needs to be regulated. They want it extended to those without driving licenses. So at the moment, one of the real problems with the trials is the very cohort that are most attracted to e-scooter use are the younger, sort of tween, later teens, early 20s cohort, a lot of whom don't have driving licenses, and so technically can't use the e-scooter trials and technically don't have an opportunity to use them legally, because of course the license is the only way you can ensure there's insurance to go with it, and that sort of follow through. They had concerns about speed, concerns about shared use, which is an increasing problem, and the impact on the vulnerable, particularly those hard of hearing or poor of sight who can't mediate what's approaching behind them. So anyway, then nothing's happened. And so this idea, as we said, that was when the transport bill was kicked down the path in November, that further research would be done. Woohoo, they've announced that they're going to have a revisitation of the topic to catch up on the findings from the ongoing trials, because of course they've done a lot of work already. If anybody wants to be involved, evidence is being accepted until Wednesday the 22nd of February, so you've still got time to be heard. And they're basically updating that first report, and we can see that, you know, things are changing around the place. I mentioned Paris a little while ago. 4 years on, they're going to have a referendum in April as to whether to get rid of them altogether. So their e-scooters, you know, they're now having a kind of consideration of whether they want them, and we're still trying to legislate as to what they're going to look like. Anyway, what might this all turn into? I'm going to hand over to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about PACTS and what they've discovered.
Thank you, Emily. So PACTS is the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety. It's a cross-party charity which has been looking into data around the injuries arising from e-scooter use. This is important for claimants and for defendants, insurers alike, because of course the nature of an e-scooter means that the nature of injuries that arise from them is quite different. So you can see there, we've put some of the highlights on the slides. 300 injury collisions in the UK in March 2022, published in March 2022, and 27 fatalities. Now that's a striking figure, because of course most of those were not in respect of the trial e-scooters, but in fact all but 4 were riding private e-scooters. So again, 23 of those fatalities arising out of vehicles which are currently illegal on the roads, and therefore perhaps again a clarion call for regulations to ensure that those which are privately owned are used safely. But strikingly, 2 years before that, only 3 fatalities, so the increase is astronomical. And again, it's similarly in respect of private e-scooter sales, increasing all the time. Interestingly, from our perspective, the kinds of injuries that are coming out are also quite different. So you don't just have an increase in the number of injuries caused by these kind of vehicles, but the injuries are also more serious. So normally about 20% of the casualties from your quote unquote standard road traffic accident would be classed as serious injuries, but there's a 10% increase in, when it comes to e-scooters. So actually 30% of e-scooter injuries are serious ones, which means that we're looking at potentially not just an increase in claims, but also an increase in the value of claims, contingent on obviously the severity of the injuries. And you can see that, I suppose, when you think about them in practical terms, because they are, you are very close to the road, moving quickly, not wearing very much PPE. And we've seen things like an increase in head injuries, for example, which is a big part of e-scooter use, and PACTS has picked up on that as well. It's also important to note that the PACTS data, although it is careful and carefully collected, is almost certainly underrepresentative of the reality of the situation. The reason being that it is derived from police records. And of course, if you are riding something that is illegal, that you could get a £300 fine and 6 points on your license, are you likely to report an accident deriving from it? Probably not. So what we wonder is whether actually even the best data that the government and anybody can harvest on this is going to be significantly underrepresentative because of the nature of the regulations or lack thereof at the moment. And similarly, there's little incentive to report a single vehicle collision. So another point that PACTS has picked up on is that contrary to your pedestrian versus vehicle or vehicle on vehicle collisions, a lot of these are people just falling off them or driving them into inanimate objects. And of course, where you don't have any obligation to report, you're doing something which is illegal anyway, and actually no one else was involved. the chances of you reporting that are quite low. And so PACS has set out a real flag here, which is that, look, this is the best data we've been able to obtain on this, but it's almost certainly underrepresentative. And we come on a bit later to talk about some other data that's available. But moving on to the injury statistics themselves, as I've just said, most of the injuries are single vehicles. So they are either people falling off them or their collisions with inanimate objects. That might change as people get more familiar with using them and for the specific risks that they pose. But it means that one needs to be thinking more broadly from a liability perspective about, could liability arise in any other ways that are not just simply claimant and defendant? Are we pursuing product liability claims against the scooter manufacturers themselves, for example? Are people going to make claims on their own insurance policies if they fall off on, et cetera, et cetera? So we are not seeing that it's not possible to simply map the statistics that we have from road traffic accidents and collisions generally onto e-scooters, because they do have specific and different circumstances which create specific and different injuries. And so if you look at some of the other points we've raised there, the data, as we've said, is sparse and disconnected and likely to be underreported. And in Europe, we're seeing 10 times more e-scooter injuries compared with pedestrians and cycles. So that's a strikingly different or a bigger increase than we're seeing from the PACS data. And that's in places where private e-scooters are, of course, legal and regulated, because in Europe, most countries have now legalized them. But what it means is that there's a higher proportion of good quality, or there's a higher amount of good quality data coming out of Europe now. And what that's showing, for example, is that the majority of casualties are riders who fall from their e-scooters, and between 20 and 50% sustain head injuries. So that's a huge increase compared with road traffic road traffic accidents generally. But also,
I was going to say, I think also it's the manner of which people, you know, the way that a scooter is set up. You've got your kind of shaft of the handle right over the front wheel. You're very, very front heavy, and so the opposite of as a bike, when you've got your front wheel and your handlebars, and you're much more likely to be pushed back, even if you brake hard, and we all know that you can tip a bike forwards. But with a scooter, you're always on that point, that cusp of literally falling forward. I think is one of the design features. I mean, it's the whole way in which they exist. And it'll be interesting seeing some of the designs of the sit-on scooter, which is the other thing, because people find it tiring to stand up that long, when they look almost more like a sort of teeny tiny kind of electric wheelchair type thing, and the bar comes back and you sit much further back, and then you are on your little e-scooter, and whether that'll actually be safer because your weight's further back. Anyway, sorry, that was just my musing.
Well, and actually on that point, in a lot of countries in Europe, they are now creating mandatory helmet wearing regulations to deal with exactly that. So it's something that European countries are noticing. And then just finally, the injuries are related from things like not wearing a helmet, be it drunk scooting and loss of control. And so with the trials, you are able to deal with those points because you have tests when you hire one after a certain time at night, a whack-a-mole challenge on the Lime scooters where you have to react and press a button within a certain amount of time to prove that you're not too pissed to ride one.
It is such an enormous sign now. I don't know if anyone's done it. If you can't hit that, you probably can't unlock it actually. But
yeah, exactly. If you can't hit that, I'm not sure you should be walking home, let alone cycling.
Yeah, that's true.
And some the voice scooters in Bristol, for example, turn off after, I think it's 10:30 p.m, so just before pub kicking out time, for exactly that reason. But of course, you can't do any of that if they're privately owned, because those control methods aren't there.
That's true.
So handing over now to Emily to talk about the recommendations that PACS have suggested ought to be put in place.
Yeah, so PACS, I mean, for the suggestion that there needs to be further research done, poor old PACS, they've done a pretty stunning job so far, I have to say. And they've come up with I mean, in some ways, what's really interesting is their highlight takeaway is that scooters are here and are going to be present and indeed have a place, but it requires collective responsibility. And in some ways, a lot of the discussions, that you hear, some of the sort of parliamentary discussions and some of the concerns raised is it's very much a sort of us and them, and it's a kind of I'm a little old lady trying to walk to the shops and they whisper me on their e-scooters type thing, and the different kind of silos of behavior, whereas that kind of concept of all coming together, collective responsibility and community action being the way forward. Anyway, the safe vehicles are obviously their key mandate, and they recommend therefore a minimum front wheel size of 12 inches, and the point of that is, as you can see in the photo there, there's a teeny tiny wheel, is as we all know from Highway Act claims and from the top dressing on roads, that will be a sufficient size that will be able to get you in and out of what I'd call your sort of average pothole. And indeed the scooters in London have these bigger wheels for that reason, to enable them to get in and out. 2 independently controlled bikes, brakes, excuse me, 2 independently controlled brakes to enable you to be able to stop front and back. Lighting to be mandatory at all times. Now, I think lighting is a real problem, because when you look at the trial scooters that all have lights, of course, there's nowhere to put them. The light is inevitably really, really low down at the back, because it's the only bit of a scooter that exists. So I wonder whether there'll ever be a move to have a little arm at the back of your scooter so that you can have a light higher up. I've seen quite
some kind of compulsory, you've got to wear a red light on the back of your helmet or something.
I was going to say, you quite often see people and they've got those flashing ones on the back of their helmet, which is slightly disconcerting, but obviously a lot safer. A maximum unladen weight of 20 kgs and an audible warning device to be mandatory, which I think is something that's also coming in for all sort of electric vehicles per se, that kind of that silent whoosh behind you and you turn around and there's a Tesla. That idea that in fact they all need to make a noise to alert us to their presence. So that's the sort of real life and computation modeling showing that small wheels, also not just this top dressing of the road, it makes the e-scooters much less able to navigate change in the road surface and less stable when turning, because you've got such a small wheel and it's very difficult when you're accelerating and braking. So those are pretty key elements. Safe speed is another one, and of course Dan's already told us about the speed limits. Now PACT have come down on the side of saying 12.5, which is very slow compared to most of the trials, and that lots of them can go at 15, and that's the maximum for rental trials, but PACT think that actually that in itself is too high. And you can see their crash test dummy pictures showing, what tends to happen if you hit something at speed. The other problem that they've dealt with, they're concerned with as well, is that people tend to tamper with the mechanism. It's very easy if you buy an e-scooter to be able to override the speed limiter on it, and that's quite dangerous, well, very dangerous. And so PACT say that there also should be a separate rule or a separate legislation for that to be prohibited by law, and that the maximum continuous rated motor power should be 250 watts. So there's the thing about speed and there's the thing about power, and very simply, power is what gets you up the hill. So the power of the battery to kind of chug you up the hill, and then the speed is what you can sort of turn on when you're going along. The crash testing that you can sort of see pictographed on the right, but crash testing has found that when the scooter's traveling at 15.5 miles an hour, and an adult pedestrian is struck, they get thrown a number of meters and would really suffer serious injury. But at 9 miles an hour, although they can fall, the injuries are much more moderate. So there's that, the slower the pace of the collision, the significant improvement. Now we all know the dynamics of collisions are affected by angle and so on and so forth, but without doubt speed makes a difference. Imperial College have carried out some computational modelling of e-scooter riders using an e-scooter with different wheels and different size wheels and travelling at different speeds, aiming to understand how e-scooters are influenced by speed and surface condition. and measuring the resulting head ground impact, basically when you come off, the velocity and the force. So reducing an e-scooter from 30k, so 20 miles an hour, to about 12 miles an hour led to a 14% reduction in the mean impact speed, 12% reduction in the mean impact force on that imperial test. So significant. And we all know that you don't need an awful lot of difference to make the difference between an injured party returning to functional capacity and not. And then safe user behaviour is the third plank of PACT's campaign of recommendations. They want helmet wearing to be mandatory. They want riding on the pavement to be prohibited. I think they're pushing at a pretty open door there. But of course, that's a massive change in user behaviour because, of course, it's illegal. Always has been. Can't think it always won't be. But people do it. And one of the things I've noticed, actually, in the time I cycle a lot in London, is that in London, cyclists have become much more badly behaved since the e-scooter trials have been going on, because they see e-scooters bumping up on the curb and bumping onto the pavement. And this is my take. I mean, I might be wrong. And I obviously haven't stopped and asked everyone. But I think you see people behave badly. You see them going through the red light. You see them bumping up onto the pavement. You think, well, I'm going to do that as well. And so you've got many more bikes doing it as well. And the second thing I think is with the building, this is another whole story, but building of on road and slightly side of road bike paths that makes people come out of the road. Anyway, that's another story. I'll park that, going off beam. But I think the riding on the pavement thing is a really difficult change of behaviour, although a very easy win on prohibition. They want a rider age limit of at least 16 years. I think that's a really interesting and quite difficult one. I don't think that'll come in. The only one that I can think of that's comparable is using the Santander, the Boris bikes. So you have to be over 14 to use those. But we don't tend to have limits like that other than for driving. And it's very interesting if you put an e-scooter into that category. You know, you palpably don't have that for bikes. You see teeny people cycling on roads. So that'd be interesting. Carrying a passenger being prohibited, that's a big one, causing lots and lots of concerns. In Paris, for example, one of the things they're talking about with their current plan to ban, well, no, not plan, their current referendum about banning scooters altogether. One of the key complaints is having two people on the scooters. And there's a pushback from the companies that provide the scooters, the e-scooters in Paris, of coming up with technology that will basically tell if you've got more than one person and will just stop working. Now, again, those things are much easier to mediate in a public trial than they are in private use. Anyway, gosh, time is flowing on. So let's crack on, and over to you, Dan.
Yeah, so I think take this very quickly. So the Department of Transport has also has done their own looking at the stats on this. And basically what they found is that there have been a real striking number of collisions which have created lots of injuries. But moving on then, basically there's one headline which I want to draw your attention to on the following page, and you can come back and look at these stats in great detail, because this is a slightly terrifying wall of text here with a lot of numbers. But basically 2 points here. Number one, just like the PACS data, the Department for Transport data relies heavily on reporting to police. And therefore, for the same reasons as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be likely to be an underreport. Secondly, every single one of those figures you see there has increased as between this year and last year, or the year that the data was published and the year before. So we are seeing an increase in the number of casualties. We're seeing an increase in the number of injuries. We're seeing an increase in the number of collisions. Every single thing is going up, and there's nothing to suggest that that trend is not going to continue. What does that mean for us as litigators? Well, it means that the chances of seeing more claims coming through arising out of these are going to be, is likely to be higher as well. So that's all I wanted to say on that, but the stats do make for very interesting reading if you do have time.
Okay, so then also just romping on a little bit, because we don't have a lot of time left. TRL Academy have just published last month an in-depth investigation into e-scooter performance, and it is quite Well, if I say I think it's really interesting, that probably outs me as sadder than most. But anyway, it is interesting. So TRL, if you don't know, they are the subsidiary of the Transport Research Foundation. It's a not-profit company. Basically, they live to provide the impartial furtherance of transport and related research. They're good eggs that look into stuff and provide impartial data. And one of their big questions they're looking at is illegality of scooter use. And as I say, in January 2023, they looked at the e-scooter performance and looking at the capability of privately owned devices and the manufacture of published data, because of course, a lot of the things we've been talking about have come through from the trials where you can control and mandate and limit, etc. So on and so forth. So they discovered that of the private devices, acceleration is most affected by motor size. So you remember Pax said you want to have a relatively small motor. The smaller the motor, then whatever your top speed may be, you're less torquey and you can get there less quickly. Speed is quite often overstated as per se going at 12 or 15 is not necessarily a good determinant of safety, other than, as Pax has just shown us, at the point of collision. But in terms of use and safe use and maneuverability, motor size makes a big difference, and wheel size, as we've seen in terms of maneuverability and ability to cope with things on road surfaces, makes a big difference. And we probably all know, I don't know if any of you got into the inline skating craze, but there's nothing like those little wheels. You can be downed by a twig, frankly, when you've got depending on how good you are at skating, not very in my case, but going around the park, if there's quite a lot of twigs, that's enough that you can just stop your wheel dead, and with little micro wheels that can be quite risky.
I was thinking about this in terms of highways claims as well, because we have our rules of thumb about what creates a danger
what's a hazard. Yeah, exactly.
And do we need to go back and think about all of that on the basis that now actually we have to accommodate a new type of vehicle with much smaller wheels, or vice versa? Do the wheels need to be big enough that they can comment your average pothole as you would? Well, that is
that is interesting. So I mean, I suppose in London they took the latter decision. So the wheels in London on the trial scooters have to be big enough to cope with your average pothole. But as you say, if you've got that sort of, lots and lots of the private ones have very small wheels, do we need to look again? And of course, with that base plate, it hits a pothole, doesn't come out. Sorry, Dan.
No, I was just saying, and should we, as if you act for highways authorities, should you be advising them to train their inspectors to say, look, there's a trial running in this place, so you need to include, when you're going through your inspection reports on various main roads, that you've got to be looking out for these as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If you've got something that's legitimately on the road and you're legitimately meant to be keeping safe, then your highway needs to be suitable for it. Absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, so the next slightly depressing thing about this e-scooter performance is weight of rider has an effect. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to feed into the public health. We know the public health dynamic gets a bit squeamish even about cutting the sugar or putting labels on things. So I doubt that that's going to get a lot of traction, but it makes a difference. And also, perhaps not surprisingly, and this feeds into bicycles as well, and into all sorts of private and domestic, unless you've got an MOT system like you have with the cars, maintenance is parlous. So of the e-scooters that they picked up and tested by TRL, 55% of them had flat tires. And we know, if you remember the case of Emily, what was her name, Hartridge, the very first poor lady that was killed by an e-scooter in Battersea Park, and I know she was called Emily, which I always remember, and her surname begins with H. She had a flat tire. Her private e-scooter had a flat tire, and that was causative of her accident. 40% had mud guards missing, and of course with those little wheels it doesn't take a lot of mud to make a big difference. And 50%, even worse, had poor and unworking brakes and steering. And after that, there's not much left, really. Flat tires, no brakes, and missing mud guards with your tiny wheels. It's a recipe for disaster. They did find that the e-scooters could broadly manage the 40mm vertical obstruction. And as you know, that's our determinant at the moment for highways. So perhaps some of the highway inspectors, if you're watching here, can breathe a little easier. But the other thing that they did, which is really interesting, is they created the very first set, I think, of reference data for the purposes of collision reconstruction. So if, as we think is likely, there's going to be an increase or indeed a start of claims coming through, or of collisions or accidents relating to e-scooter use, they're starting to gather the data to look at collision reconstruction. So you can say, you know, this is or is not what was likely to happen. So moving on to Dan, let's have a look at illegality, because that's one of the things that we often get asked about in relation to.
Absolutely. This is one of the key questions that comes up, I think, on both the claimant and defendant sides when you have accidents that arise out of privately owned e-scooters. Of course, it's an obvious one because they are illegal on the road. So is there a defence of illegality available on the basis that they never should have been being driven in the first place? And I think it's clear that the defence is available. The question is whether the defence is a good one and whether it would be successful. But just a very quick reminder, the case of Patel and Mirza is the most recent Supreme Court comment on the matter. And you have to look at the seriousness of the conduct, its centrality to the issue, whether it was intentional and whether there was a marked disparity in the parties' culpability. So very helpful comments from the Supreme Court, which map very easily onto considerations about e-scooters, or perhaps not. But really what we've boiled this down to is that the defence relies on the public principle of you shouldn't profit from your illegal actions. That's the fundamental. And so if you had something like a standard car against e-scooter collision, how would those factors be applied? Well, you've got to ask yourself, would the purpose of the prohibition be enhanced by denying the claim? Are there other relevant public policies that would be impacted by this? And importantly, I think in this respect, whether denial of the claim would be a proportionate response to the illegality. Because of course, are we in a situation where you have, for example, a car that is driven without an MOT or without insurance? Should that driver lose the ability to claim? Or is it on the far side of the spectrum? Should the getaway driver who has just run out of robbing a bank be able to claim for an RTA that they are subsequently involved in? There are degrees of criminality, and there is therefore always a question of whether it would be proportionate to say no to the entirety of the claim. And I think particularly in respect of this matter and where we are at the moment, the comments are in terms of where the legislature is ending up on this also feed into that. Because if you've got something where you've got trials on the road and you've also got comments from the government that these things, that the e-scooters, privately owned e-scooters, will be legalized, then you've got to ask yourself the question of, okay, well, though it's technically illegal at the moment, really, with the direction of travel being so strongly in one direction, would it be proportionate and would it serve the public policy objective to deny someone the whole of the claim? Now, that's not to express a whole view or a concluded view on this point, but it's certainly something which is obviously of interest to claimants and defendants who are litigating some of the private e-scooter claims that are coming through at the moment. And
of course, what you might also want to feed into that consideration is whether the conduct you're talking about is simply the fact that it is a private e-scooter. But other than that, you know, they're wearing a helmet, they're riding slowly, they're on the road, or whether it's something that's being ridden in a way that is illegal, or for example, even a hire scooter that's not per se illegal, but it's weaving in and out of the street with the drunk rider not wearing a helmet without lights on. So there's also that kind of that per se element of being illegal from the top, or the conduct feeding into it as well, I think is something that requires consideration.
Yeah, of course. And I think the flip side actually on that point, the kind of the corollary to that argument is, yes, but the conduct is intimately linked to the illegality, because of course, if you were being lawful about it, they wouldn't be on the road at all.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, on this, particularly in the case of the private e-scooter, they wouldn't be there at all. So just moving on from that, if that's all right, Dan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the other case is that you'll may well be more familiar with because it's more intimately connected with our core area of practice, is the case of Henderson. With Erica Henderson, the paranoid schizophrenic, and she was managed in the community, but tragically she had a period of deterioration and killed her mother. She was convicted of manslaughter. She pleaded guilty to diminished responsibility, and there was a hospital order. Now, this is a 2020 Supreme Court, so it is a little bit after Patel and Mirza, and considered the interface of Gray and Thames Trains, Patel and Mirza, and this case. So Supreme Court had to look at the position. So the hospital admitted negligent breach of duty. They admitted that that it was a common ground that the act of killing her mother would not have occurred but for their breach of management of her deteriorating mental health. But they pleaded the defence of extirpi, and so she brought a civil claim for losses arising from her detention and PTSD, and also loss of the benefit of the will. So the concept, you're liable for the mental health treatment by the defendant, but are they liable for the losses that effectively arise out of her illegal conduct? Did that preclude success? So what they did was they looked at the Supreme Court was the decision, or is the decision in Gray, which is, if you don't remember, is Gray and Thames Trains Limited, which is 2009 House of Lords as it then was case. Could that be distinguished? And if not, should you depart from Gray because of the case that Dan was telling us about of Patel and Mirza, which is the 2016 case? So in Gray, the damages arose from the sentence imposed by the criminal court and by the criminal act, and so very similar in terms of conduct. And it was held that the lack of personal responsibility, so the distinction being drawn in Henderson was that she had diminished responsibility, and in the sentencing remarks the judge had said effectively, although she'd done the act, she was, her personal responsibility was light for that criminal act. The Supreme Court said that doesn't matter. The consideration for the extirpi judgment is that of the criminal responsibility, not the degree of personal responsibility. So the degree of personal responsibility might feed into the concept of sentence, but it's the fact of criminal responsibility that then determines whether you have that consideration of extirpi. So then they decided that it wasn't therefore incompatible with Patel. So Gray remains good law, the reasoning remains good, and then you look and feed into Patel, and they again the Supreme Court underlined their own correct approach, saying that the correct approach to the defence is balancing these public policy considerations. The underlying public policy and the policy question, which Dan's already told us about, is the concept of recovery for something which is illegal. Does that produce an inconsistent result that's disharmonious with the law, and does it cause damage to the integrity of your legal system? Is that something that you can manage? And so those three factors still need to be looked at. One, the underlying purpose of illegality in question and whether that purpose is enhanced by denying the claim. Two, whether there's any other relevant public policy on which denying the claim has an impact. And three, whether denying the claim is proportionate in response to that illegality, which is really that last point, Dan, that you were talking about in particular with the e-scooter. And in Henderson, they said that those three considerations didn't lead to a different outcome. So even with this Erica Henderson in her state of diminished responsibility, it doesn't affect the outcome. So Gray is Patel compliant and should continue to be applied. Now we've only got, oh no, we're over time. Oh my Lord, we're over time. But we're going to very quickly talk about a couple of the cases. Evidence. I don't know if you want to talk about evidence, Dan, or do you want to just romp through this?
Well, I think the point to say about evidence is don't forget that you should investigate this much like it's a standard collision. So ask questions about whether there's desk cam footage, etc. Talk to witnesses. Ask yourself who was riding, what was the type and the owner of the scooter, so privately or trial scooter. Training and experience of the rider, very important. Is this your first time on them, or is this not? Were they intoxicated at the time? Also consider getting early expert evidence. So get the scooter itself examined if you can. or if you think it will help, but bear it in mind, preserve it at least so that it's there to be looked at by an expert if you think you need it later down the line. And finally, if it's a trial, remember the rules of that scheme. As we pointed out already, they are different in different places. So make sure that your claimant is complying with the rules, or as defendants, look at whether the claimant was complying with the rules. New evidence that is available, peculiar to these claims, is that you'll get GPS data if they're a trial e-scooter, and you'll also get geocaching. So you'll be able to track how fast, where, when, etc. You'll also get evidence of parking. And of course, you may get evidence that they were being used at a time when they were not supposed to, or that they had been adapted illegally. Bear in mind that you shouldn't carry too much. That will definitely found a contributory negligence point, even if not an entire defence, if it turns out that the person who's using it is carrying, you know, everything in the kitchen sink on them. And of course, bear in mind that 2 users is a no-no, and so ask about whether there was 1 or 2 riders.
So I suppose of those points of evidence, the first half of those will only really be relevant on the e-scooter trials, but the concept of illegal adaptations, that's going to be really potent for the private e-scooter, given that we know they're tampered with. And just thinking about it, we also ought to add in maintenance, given the finding from TRL. How flat is your tyre? How bad are your brakes? I mean, those are things you'd think about anyway, but it looks like they're going to be pretty potent for e-scooters. So and carrying items. Now, this is a bête noire of mine. What is the point? What is the point of having last mile transport to get you out of your car when, you know, what do? You're going to go shopping, or you're going to go to work, or you're going to go, and you're going to be carrying stuff. So I really wish they had, you know, the lovely e-bikes that you can hire. They've all got nice big baskets. But I don't know whether, I mean, you could, this is an idea for any designer who's listening, put a basket on the back of your e-scooter, and that gives you a perfect place to put a light. There you go. In one moment, we've solved it all.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking the last time that I raised one, it was with a bag on the handlebars, and it's chaos, absolute chaos.
Oh, my Lord.
You know,
they're bad enough to turn, aren't they?
Exactly. Yeah.
The turning circle of a small hippo they have. I mean, they're terrible. Anyway, but look, if you're still with us, we've got a treat. There's been a case. You might have heard about Drago and the London Borough of Barnet, which is, we think, the first actual trial of an e-scooter and illegality that we know about. November 2022. So you might think we're going to tell you the outcome, but sadly, His Honour Judge Aluba got so keen on it, or the matter became so involved that they have a further hearing, 2 days of further argument, sadly not until March. So we could put on an Easter special for you and come back in March and tell you what the outcome is, if we know. But this is the case, you know, joking aside, it's as always, these cases are born out of the unhappy effects and casualties of the daily round. And Ms. Drago is a lady of Brazilian descent. She'd come to England not long before her accident. She said in her evidence she didn't speak or read English well at the time of the accident. I'm not sure she's a Portuguese speaker, but she had basically bought an e-scooter online. It came with a pamphlet that she hasn't kept, and which may or may not have warned her about where to use it, but she couldn't really read it, didn't really know. And in fact, because she'd recently arrived in England, she wasn't aware that it was illegal to use a private e-scooter. And I mean, you know, one may have some sympathy with that looking out of the window. So her evidential response to the challenge of illegality is basically one of unknowing. She was riding the e-scooter. She did have a helmet on, didn't have any other pads. And basically in Barnet, she was on a road that either went through or alongside a park. And basically she went into a pothole. So a Highways Act claim, went into the pothole, bike didn't come, well, e-scooter didn't bump out, and she suffered injury to her leg. I think she broke her knee or leg. Anyway, it was a leg injury. The accident was October 2020. Now, I think it wasn't reported by her until the following January. And what was interesting was part of the London Borough's defence was that essentially they had a good regime and they responded very quickly. And indeed, they were notified of a problem on this spot and within 24 hours had filled in the pothole. So essentially, the defence is being offered of the usual Highways Act, Section 41 breach, Section 58 defence, with illegality very much as a sort of second tier. You know, if you don't like what we have to say on this, then throw it out anyway. But it has been argued in court, and it has had a full hearing, and there are further arguments. And certainly the mood music is that the judge was at the very least curious or intrigued by the illegality arguments, perhaps thinking he can be giving one of the first judgments and find us in higher court being tested. But one of the questions that's been asked or looked at is the level of warning provided by the supplier, and whether or not, you know, you've sufficiently discharged duty by adding in a brochure that couldn't be read. And it's an interesting case because, as I say, it's being challenged and argued. Whether we end up with a Highways Act defence judgment, of which we've seen many, or whether we get something a little bit more exciting, we have to wait and see later on this spring. And finally, there was a little e-scooter, not an e-bike case up in Manchester. I mean, again, interesting, really only because you don't get many e-bike fought cases. And this one turned very much on what we were saying right at the beginning, that for all the kind of new micromobility, you end up with the sort of old-fashioned contrib. So basically here, there was a bike making a right-hand turn across slow traffic, wearing a high visibility jacket, but struck by a car when the bike was turning across the lane and was hit by the car. The car driver said they just couldn't see the bike, and it came really quickly because it was electric. It sort of whooshed with whooshed isn't the technical term, is it? It's it's a high sort of well, you know, you're talking, you accelerate, it has high acceleration. Anyway, the driver said he couldn't see because of low-lying sun. That's a defence we haven't seen before. So effectively it went along traditional, so to speak, lines of what can you see, what did you do, were you driving within the capacity of your presence. So you might have been going at below the speed limit, but if you can't see because of the low-lying sun, that's too fast. It ended up being a split liability case, not much of a surprise there, but 75% the fault of the cyclist, which on your, you know, if you had your presumed liability, would not be the way it would go, I suspect, but given the conduct of the parties, it was. So our very final thing is over to Dan for the final words.
Yes, well, all we've done here is we've just collected together 3 cases which have basically highlighted different points where the law has grappled with questions that arise specifically in respect of micromobility. And essentially, you can read the summaries that we've got there, but the point is this: they clearly do need regulating. They clearly need regulating better, and the kinds of decisions that have come out, and you can see that they're not all recent decisions by any stretch of the imagination, show that these are issues which have been persisting for a while and are still persisting when it comes to e-scooters. So I leave you to read those at your leisure.
So finally, you've all been very good. I'm sorry we've gone on too long, but thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us. If the numbers are to be believed, there's still quite a lot of you out there. So if you do have any questions, you've been ever so quiet, nothing's come up in our chat box. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact us. There'll be a recording of this popped up if you've got any friends, neighbours or willing victims who haven't seen it and would like to share it later. You'll find it on our website soon. Thank you. I think it just remains for me and Dan to say thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us. We hope it has been a little bit interesting, a little bit diverting, and that we will see you again soon.